My name is Joanna, a 28-year-old software engineer who has spent the last 5 years quietly providing for everyone in this household while slowly fading into the background of my own life. I was just beginning to relax when my sister Colette marched into the living room with an air of unearned authority and abruptly shut off the TV before I could even utter a word of protest. Enough of this trash. I hate this show, and I am absolutely sick of hearing this garbage blaring through the house every single evening. She snapped while tossing the remote onto the coffee table with total contempt. I looked over at my parents expecting some semblance of support, or at least a recognition of my basic right to exist in the space I paid for, but they simply stood there in silence. Instead of defending me, Mom stepped forward and softly insisted that I should just be the bigger person and yield to my sister, because Colette was supposedly dealing with immense work pressure lately. The sheer irony of her statement burned in my throat, because I was the one currently paying the mortgage, the utilities, and even the very cable subscription that she had just cut off without a second thought. If you have ever felt like a ghost in your own home or been constantly overlooked by the people you sacrifice everything for, please hit the subscribe button to see exactly how I turned the tables and reclaimed my justice in this story. The house in Madison should have been a sanctuary of warmth and support, but for a long time it has evolved into a massive financial burden weighing heavily upon my shoulders. Every month begins with the same exhausting routine of reviewing mortgage statements and utility bills that I alone am responsible for settling. While my parents Walter and Lillian enjoy their retirement in peace, they seem to have collectively decided that my income is a communal resource rather than the fruit of my own labor as a software engineer. They never ask if I can afford the rising property taxes or the soaring electricity costs, because they have grown accustomed to the comfort I provide without ever offering a single word of gratitude. It feels as if my presence in this family is only valued by the balance in my bank account while my personal needs are treated as an afterthought. Meanwhile, Colette continues to maintain a lavish and completely fraudulent lifestyle that stands in stark contrast to the quiet sacrifices I make every single day. She frequently struts through the front door carrying designer shopping bags from high-end boutiques and talking loudly about the exclusive parties she attends with the city's elite. Even though I know for a fact she is drowning in debt and hasn't earned a steady paycheck in over a year, Dad still chooses to praise her as a woman of impeccable style and social grace. He often points to her flashy outfits as proof of her supposed success, while conveniently ignoring the fact that I am the one keeping the lights on and the pantry stocked. The blatant favoritism in this house is almost suffocating because Colette is treated like a celebrated guest, while I am viewed as little more than a reliable ATM. The situation in the kitchen is often even more demoralizing because Mom completely overlooks the grueling hours I spend staring at code late into the night. Instead of acknowledging my professional achievements or my exhaustion, she only seems concerned with whether I have prepared a gourmet dinner for Colette. One evening, after I had worked a 12-hour shift to meet a critical project deadline, Mom approached me with a frown and asked why I hadn't made my sister's favorite pasta dish yet. When I tried to explain that I was barely keeping my eyes open, she merely sighed and remarked that I should be more considerate of Colette's fragile emotional state. It is truly baffling how my literal physical exhaustion is consistently outweighed by Colette's fabricated drama in the eyes of my own parents. The tension finally reached a breaking point last Tuesday when I discovered that Colette had unilaterally decided to rearrange my private home office. She had unceremoniously dumped my professional hardware and sensitive project files into cardboard boxes so she could set up a ridiculous virtual business suite for her non-existent real estate ventures. When I confronted her about invading my space, she simply laughed and claimed that her entrepreneurial vision required a more professional backdrop than her own messy bedroom. Dad walked in during the argument, and immediately took her side, telling me that I should stop being so possessive over a room that belongs to the family home. This blatant disregard for my professional boundaries made me realize that I am not a respected member of this household, but merely a tenant who pays for her own displacement. A profound sense of isolation and resentment has begun to fester within me, as I realize that my role is strictly limited to providing financial security for people who do not truly see me. I spent hours sitting in the darkness of my room and listening to the three of them laughing in the hallway, feeling like an outsider in a house that I bought with my own hard-earned money. The realization that they would likely replace me with a more compliant source of income if they could is a bitter pill to swallow after years of loyalty. I am no longer interested in seeking their approval or waiting for a thank you that will never come, because I finally understand that their love is entirely conditional upon my silence and my checkbook. Driven by a new sense of self-preservation, I have started to quietly document every single cent I spend on this ungrateful family while gathering evidence of Colette's financial deception. I began checking the mailbox before anyone else woke up, and discovered a mountain of overdue credit card notices and legal threats hidden among the junk mail. Colette had been carelessly tossing these red envelopes into the back of the pantry, hoping that her secrets would remain buried forever under the weight of my reliability. I carefully photographed each document and created a digital trail of her irresponsibility to ensure that I would have undeniable proof when the time came to tear down her house of cards. This silent accumulation of truth is the only thing giving me a sense of control in a home where my voice has been systematically silenced for far too long. 3 days after that incredibly tense evening, an event took place in the middle of the night that completely transformed my perception of my sister forever. I had been struggling to sleep due to the lingering resentment from our last argument, and decided to head downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I approached the hallway, the low but frantic murmur of a voice stopped me in my tracks and forced me to press my back against the cold wall. I realized it was Colette standing by the kitchen island and engaging in a heated conversation with someone on the other end of a phone call. The desperation in her tone was unmistakable, as she pleaded for more time to settle an staggering debt that amounted to over $400,000. I stood frozen in the shadows while listening to her admit that her failed investments had left her with absolutely nothing but a mountain of legal threats. The conversation took an even darker turn when Colette began detailing a calculated plan to deceive Mom and Dad into signing away the ownership of our family home. She explained to the person on the phone that she had already prepared a set of documents disguised as routine health insurance renewals and general power of attorney forms. Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper as she boasted about how easy it would be to manipulate our parents because they never bothered to read the fine print before signing anything she handed them. If they sign those papers, all of my debts will disappear instantly, and they won't even realize they have lost their house until it is far too late for them to fight back, Colette muttered with a cold indifference that made my blood run cold. Hearing those words from my own sister felt like a physical blow to my chest, because it proved she was willing to render her own parents homeless just to save herself from her own financial ruin. My mind began to race as I connected the dots and realized that Colette had already drained the secret emergency savings that Mom and Dad had spent decades accumulating for their retirement. It became clear that she had been chased by aggressive debt collectors for months and was now backed into a corner with no other way out than to prey on her own flesh and blood. The realization that my parents were about to become victims of a cruel financial trap set by their favorite child sent a wave of nausea through my entire body. I felt a mixture of profound sorrow for Walter and Lillian, along with an intense, burning rage toward the woman I used to call my sister. They were being led toward a cliff by the very person they had spent years defending against my logical warnings and concerns. As soon as Colette retreated to her bedroom, I waited for the house to fall silent before I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the large trash bins behind the garage. My hands were trembling as I began to sift through layers of discarded luxury packaging and household waste in search of the evidence I knew she was hiding. Deep at the bottom of the bin, I discovered several crumpled envelopes from high-profile law firms and debt collection agencies that were addressed directly to Colette. These documents contained final notices of intent to sue and detailed the massive sums she had borrowed under false pretenses from various private lenders. Each letter was a testament to her deception and confirmed that the lavish lifestyle she paraded in front of our parents was built entirely on a foundation of stolen time and borrowed money. I took the evidence back to my room and spent the remaining hours of the night photographing every single page with my phone to ensure I had a permanent digital record. The sheer scale of her fraud was overwhelming, and I knew that simply shouting at her in front of our parents would not be enough to stop this disaster. I realized that if I acted impulsively, Colette would easily spin another web of lies to turn Mom and Dad against me, as she had done so many times in the past. I needed to be as calculated and cold as she was if I wanted to have any hope of protecting myself and securing my own future. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a television show, but a desperate battle for survival against a predator living under our roof. Instead of confronting her the next morning, I decided to take a strategic step back and begin formulating a comprehensive legal plan with professional help. I knew I had to move quickly because the deadline Colette mentioned for the house documents was approaching much faster than I had originally anticipated. I spent the early morning hours researching the best tenant rights lawyers in Madison and looking for specialists who dealt with elder financial abuse and property fraud. My heart was heavy with the weight of this secret, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years because the path forward was now undeniable. I would let her believe she was still in control for a little longer, while I quietly built a fortress of evidence that would eventually bury her entire world of lies. On Monday morning, I decided not to go to the office as usual, but instead drove to a small secluded cafe on the outskirts of Madison, where the heavy scent of roasted beans offered a temporary distraction from my internal chaos. I was there to meet my best friend Dominic, who was the only person in my life who truly understood the toxic dynamics I had endured within my own home for nearly a decade. As soon as I sat down and began recounting the horrifying discovery of Colette's plan to render our parents homeless, the dam finally broke, and the tears I had been holding back since Friday night began to flow freely. Dominic listened in a supportive silence as I described the sheer coldness in my sister's voice and the realization that my parents were being led into a financial slaughterhouse by their own favorite child. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to be patient, but instead reached across the table to steady my trembling hands with a firm and grounding presence. Dominic leaned forward with a gaze that was both compassionate and incredibly sharp, as he told me that kindness without boundaries is nothing more than permission for others to commit crimes against your soul. He insisted that my loyalty to a family that consistently devalued my contributions was becoming a form of self-destruction, and that the time for quiet endurance had officially come to an end. You are not betraying them by protecting yourself, Joanna, but you are enabling a predator if you continue to allow Colette to use your silence as a weapon against your parents. He whispered with a conviction that ignited a spark of resolve deep within my chest. His words helped me realize that by staying silent, I was essentially participating in my own family's ruin, and that I needed to act decisively if I wanted to have any future at all. We spent the next hour mapping out a list of local resources, and he promised to check in on me every single day until this nightmare was resolved one way or another. After leaving the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose, I drove directly to the law offices of my attorney Preston, who specialized in property law and elder financial exploitation cases. I sat in his polished mahogany-lined office and laid out the digital evidence I had gathered from the trash bins and the recordings I had made on my phone. Preston's expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the documents and cross-referenced them with the official public records of our family home in the Madison Municipal Database. I requested a full audit of the property title because I suspected that Colette might have already attempted to alter the ownership status without anyone noticing. The silence in the room was heavy as we waited for the system to process the requests, and I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach with every passing second of the investigation. The atmosphere turned chilling when Preston eventually looked up from his computer screen and revealed the horrifying evidence that Colette had already begun forging my signature on several private loan applications. It appeared that she had attempted to use my professional credentials and credit history to secure short-term high-interest funds to keep her creditors at bay for just a few more weeks. This discovery meant that my own financial identity was being systematically dismantled by my sister, while I was busy paying the mortgage for the roof over her head. Preston looked me directly in the eyes and said with a tone of absolute professional gravity, "Joanna, this is no longer just a messy family dispute over house chores. This is a serious criminal fraud case that could land you in deep financial trouble if we don't act right now." His words confirmed my worst fears and solidified my determination to stop being a victim and start being an adversary. To gather the undeniable proof we needed for a courtroom setting, Preston provided me with detailed professional instructions on how to install a series of discrete surveillance cameras throughout the living room and kitchen areas. He explained that we needed high-quality recordings of Colette actually attempting to manipulate Mom and Dad into signing the fraudulent documents she had prepared. These cameras were small enough to be hidden within common household items like smoke detectors and picture frames so that they would remain completely undetected by Colette during her daily routines. Preston emphasized that having a visual and audio record of her deception would be our most powerful weapon in preventing her from spinning another web of lies to turn our parents against me. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I took the equipment, realizing that my home was no longer a place of rest, but a crime scene waiting to be documented. The final hour of our meeting was dedicated to drafting what Preston called the judgment folder, a comprehensive legal arsenal designed to stop Colette's schemes dead in their tracks. We included a formal notice of intent to sue for identity theft, a preliminary eviction order based on her illegal activities, and a detailed summary of all her debts that would be presented directly to Walter and Lillian. This folder was not just a collection of papers, but a fortress of truth that would strip away Colette's mask of success once and for all in front of the people she had been deceiving. As I walked out of the law office and back into the bright afternoon sun of Madison, I felt a cold and calculated calmness settle over me for the first time in years. I was no longer the overlooked daughter who simply paid the bills, but I was now the guardian of the truth who was prepared to burn down every lie my sister had ever told. At exactly 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, just as Colette was leaving the house for another high society party, I decided to make one final and desperate attempt to save my parents from their own blindness. I watched from the window as her expensive car pulled out of the driveway, and then I turned to find Walter and Lillian sitting comfortably in the living room while enjoying their afternoon tea. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart and sat down directly across from them, clutching a small notebook where I had summarized the most critical financial red flags I had discovered. I began to speak in the most measured and calm tone I could muster, carefully explaining that our family's stability was under a severe and immediate threat due to Colette's reckless investments. I tried to show them the patterns of unpaid bills and the aggressive collection notices that had been arriving at our doorstep, hoping that facts would finally penetrate the wall of denial they had built around their favorite daughter. However, the moment I mentioned Colette's name in a negative context, Walter's expression shifted from casual interest to a mask of absolute and cold irritation. He didn't even bother to look at the notes I had prepared, but instead stood up and paced the room while accusing me of being a bitter and resentful person. Dad firmly believed that I was simply trying to tarnish my sister's reputation because I was jealous of her social standing and the glamorous lifestyle she projected on her social media accounts. He claimed that Colette was on the verge of a massive breakthrough in her real estate career, and that my interference was nothing more than a pathetic attempt to pull her down to my level of mundane reality. It was incredibly painful to realize that my years of hard work and financial support meant nothing to him compared to the hollow, filtered image of success that Colette presented to the world every day. Lillian's reaction was perhaps even more devastating because she looked at me with a profound sense of disappointment, as if I were the one betraying the family's sacred bonds. She sighed heavily and began to reproach me for intentionally destroying the peace of the household with what she called toxic and baseless suspicions that only served to create unnecessary drama. Mom insisted that a good sister should be supportive and proud of Colette's ambitions, instead of lurking in the shadows and counting every penny she spent on her professional image. When I tried to interrupt her to explain the legal consequences of the documents I had seen, she raised her hand to silence me and refused to listen to another word of my hateful logic. "Be quiet, Joanna, because Colette is out there making this family proud while you are only capable of bringing us trouble and petty jealousy," Mom shouted with a harshness that felt like a physical slap across my face. Just as the argument reached its peak, the vintage landline phone on the side table began to ring loudly and interrupted the heavy silence that followed Mom's outburst. I watched as Walter answered the call, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of confusion cross his face, as an aggressive voice on the other end began demanding to speak with Colette regarding an urgent legal matter. My heart leapt with hope, thinking that the reality of the situation was finally forcing its way into our living room through an actual debt collector. But before Dad could ask any clarifying questions, Colette suddenly burst back through the front door because she had supposedly forgotten her designer clutch and quickly snatched the phone from his hand. She laughed charmingly into the receiver and told my parents it was just another annoying telemarketer trying to sell her a useless vacation package before she hung up and redirected their attention with a clever joke about the incompetence of modern sales tactics. The ease with which she manipulated their emotions in that single moment was truly terrifying, and made me realize that her psychological hold over them was far deeper than I had ever imagined. I stood there in complete silence, watching my parents nod in agreement with her lies, while they shot me looks of pure resentment for having dared to suggest otherwise. It became clear to me that no amount of verbal warnings or logical evidence would ever be enough to break the spell she had cast over them until the disaster actually struck. I felt a cold wave of exhaustion wash over me as I realized that by trying to protect them, I was only making myself the villain in their warped and distorted version of the family narrative. The people I was trying to save were the same ones who were actively helping Colette build the gallows that would eventually hang us all financially. Without saying another word, I stood up and retreated to the solitude of my bedroom, while the sounds of their laughter echoed mockingly through the hallway behind me. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop with a chilling sense of finality, knowing that I could no longer afford to be the safety net for people who were so eager to let me fall. I navigated to our bank's secure portal and initiated the complex process of freezing the primary joint account that I had used to fund every single aspect of our lives for the past 5 years. I also set up immediate alerts to stop the automatic payments for the premium cable, the high-speed internet, and even the luxury car insurance that Colette had been using without contributing a single cent. As I clicked the final confirmation button, I felt a heavy weight lift from my chest because I was finally reclaiming the power that I had so foolishly given away to people who didn't respect my existence. 48 hours before the moment Colette intended to take our parents to the notary's office to sign their own financial death warrant, I decided to become the person they all expected me to be. I began playing the role of a remorseful and obedient younger sister, carefully masking my true intentions behind a facade of helpfulness and quiet compliance. I even went as far as helping Colette prepare her expensive outfit for what she called her monumental signing day, offering suggestions on her jewelry with a level of feigned enthusiasm that clearly caught her off guard. My sudden change in demeanor seemed to stroke her massive ego, making her believe that she had finally broken my spirit and forced me into total submission. Colette laughed mockingly while watching me fold her laundry and organize the living room, leaning against the doorframe with a look of pure arrogance. "I am glad to see that you have finally recognized your true position in this house, my dear Joanna, because it makes everything so much easier for the rest of us," she remarked with a sneer that I met with a submissive but calculated smile. The opportunity I had been waiting for finally arrived when Colette went to take a long, indulgent shower to prepare for a pre-celebration dinner with her so-called business associates. I slipped into her bedroom with the silence of a ghost and quickly located the leather briefcase where she kept the fraudulent contract she intended to trick our parents into signing the following day. My heart hammered against my ribs as I used a portable scanner to copy every single page of the documents that were disguised as routine medical and estate planning forms. These papers were the smoking gun I needed because they contained the hidden clauses that would grant Colette full authority to sell the property without Walter or Lillian ever knowing. I carefully replaced everything exactly as I had found it, ensuring that not a single paper was out of alignment to avoid triggering her suspicion before the trap was fully set. Once I was back in the safety of the living room, I spent an hour meticulously checking the camera angles of the discreet surveillance devices I had installed earlier in the week. I needed to ensure that every word and every predatory gesture Colette made during the confrontation tomorrow would be captured in high definition for the legal proceedings that were sure to follow. I adjusted the lens hidden within a decorative picture frame on the mantelpiece, confirming that the view of the coffee table and the main sofa was crystal clear and unobstructed. These recordings would be my ultimate protection against the lies I knew she would tell the moment the truth began to unravel in front of Mom and Dad. The technical precision of the setup gave me a strange sense of cold satisfaction because I knew that for once, the evidence would be impossible for anyone to ignore or explain away. Early the next morning, I took the irreversible step of officially notifying the bank that I was ceasing all payments on the mortgage and the secondary home equity line of credit. I had already prepared myself mentally for the reality that the house in Madison would eventually be sealed and foreclosed upon due to the massive debts Colette had secretly incurred in our family's name. This decision was agonizing but necessary because I refused to continue pouring my hard-earned money into a sinking ship that was being deliberately sabotaged by my own sibling. I spoke with a representative at the financial institution, with a voice that was steady and devoid of emotion, confirming that I understood the legal consequences of my actions. By cutting off the lifeblood of the household's finances, I was essentially pulling the trigger on the explosive situation that Colette had created over the past year. The most difficult part of the day was watching Walter and Lillian excitedly prepare for the celebratory dinner that they believed marked the beginning of their newfound wealth and prosperity. They were laughing and clinking glasses in the kitchen, discussing how they would spend the imaginary profits from the fake real estate venture that Colette had promised them. I watched them through the doorway with a gaze that had grown cold and detached, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with the lingering bitterness of their previous betrayals. They had no idea that the daughter they praised so highly was about to steal the very roof over their heads, and I was the only person standing between them and total ruin. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable, yet I remained silent as I watched them toast to a future that was already dissolving into nothingness. As the sun began to set on the final evening of the old family dynamic, I walked into the living room and placed the blue file folder containing the absolute truth directly onto the coffee table. I positioned it right next to the television remote, knowing that the bright color would be the first thing anyone noticed when the lights were turned on for the evening news. Inside that folder was the culmination of every piece of evidence I had gathered, from the forged signatures to the hidden debt notices and the professional audit from Preston. I sat down in the armchair and waited in the growing shadows, listening to the muffled sounds of my family's footsteps in the hallway as the clock ticked toward the moment of impact. The trap was finally set, the evidence was in place, and all that remained was for the curtains to rise on the final act of this long and painful deception. At exactly 8 o'clock on Friday night, the atmosphere in the living room was thick with a suffocating sense of artificial joy as Colette began pulling the fraudulent stacks of paperwork out of her designer bag. She was smiling brightly while explaining to our parents that these documents were merely the final formalities required to secure their future prosperity and luxury. I watched her with a detached calmness that seemed to unnerve her for a split second before she dismissed me with a flick of her wrist, as if I were nothing more than a piece of unwanted furniture. Instead of retreating to my room, as I usually did, I casually picked up the television remote and turned on the exact same program that had triggered our initial conflict, cranking the volume up until the sound echoed off the walls. The loud, booming voices from the screen shattered the carefully constructed facade of the evening and forced everyone to turn toward me in a state of utter confusion and growing irritation. Colette's face immediately contorted with rage as she lunged toward me to snatch the remote from my hand, while screaming that I was an immature child who was intentionally trying to ruin her most important business moment. I didn't flinch or move an inch, but instead pointed a steady finger toward the blue file folder resting on the coffee table, and spoke in a voice that was chillingly quiet yet firm. "You should probably read the contents of that folder before you even think about touching this television or handing those fake contracts to our parents," I said while meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her pause in midair. Walter and Lillian looked back and forth between us with expressions of deep concern, finally beginning to realize that the peace they had fought so hard to maintain was about to be permanently destroyed. I invited Dad and Mom to sit down and actually examine the certified debt statements and the undeniable evidence of forged signatures that Preston had verified with official legal stamps. As Walter began to flip through the pages, his hands started to tremble and the color drained from his face until he was as pale as a ghost in the dim light of the living room. Lillian gasped audibly when she saw her own name signed on high-interest loan applications that she had never even seen before, let alone authorized with her own hand. It was the moment of complete and total collapse for them, as they finally understood that the daughter they had praised as a golden success was actually a predator who was planning to render them homeless to cover her own failures. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had, because it was the sound of a family's trust being shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The situation turned violent when Colette realized that her mask had finally slipped beyond any hope of repair, and she suddenly transformed into a person I barely recognized. She let out a guttural scream of pure frustration and began frantically tearing the documents from the folder into tiny pieces while throwing them into the air like confetti. When she realized that destroying the copies wouldn't change the digital reality, she turned her venomous rage toward our parents and started screaming that it was all their fault for not giving her enough financial support when she was younger. She accused them of being mediocre and small-minded, claiming that her illegal actions were a justified response to the stifling poverty of their middle-class lifestyle. Walter and Lillian could only stare at her in horrified silence as they realized they had spent decades nurturing a monster who felt absolutely no remorse for her betrayal. I waited for her screaming fit to subside before I stood up and delivered the final blow that would officially end the life we had known in this house for so many years. I calmly announced to the room that I had already frozen every joint account and officially ceased all payments on the mortgage and the essential utility bills for the entire property. I explained to my stunned parents that because of the massive hidden debts Colette had incurred in their names, the bank would be moving to foreclose on and retrieve the house within the next 30 days. The realization that they were now truly facing homelessness because of their blind favoritism seemed to age them by 20 years in a single instant as they looked around the room they had once called a sanctuary. There was no more room for lies or excuses because the financial reality I had kept at bay for so long was finally crashing down upon their heads. I looked at my sister, who was now panting with exertion and looking around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape that no longer existed. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would, but instead felt a profound sense of relief that I was finally done with the burden of protecting people who didn't want to be saved. Everything is over now. Colette and the police will be arriving at this front door in less than 10 minutes to discuss the mountain of identity theft and forgery charges that Preston has filed against you, I declared, with a chillingly cold finality. I walked toward the hallway to begin packing my final suitcase, leaving the three of them to face the consequences of the web they had all played a part in weaving over the years. 2 weeks after that explosive night, the house in Madison was officially listed for sale in a state of utter shock that rippled through the entire neighborhood. The familiar sight of the well-manicured lawn was now marred by a cold metallic "for sale" sign that signaled the end of a family legacy built on a foundation of lies. Colette found herself facing a relentless wave of police summons and civil lawsuits as her creditors descended upon her like vultures once her mask of success had finally crumbled. Her social standing in Madison vanished overnight, replaced by the humiliating reality of being a disgraced fraudster whose every move was now scrutinized by investigators and former associates alike. There were no more designer bags or high society parties to hide behind, only the stark and lonely halls of a legal system that demanded full accountability for her years of calculated deception. My parents were forced to accept a bitter and heartbreaking reality as they spent their final days in the house, packing away decades of memories into cardboard boxes. Because of the massive debts Colette had incurred, they had no choice but to move into a tiny, cramped rental apartment in a remote suburb that was far away from the comforts they had once taken for granted. They were now forced to survive on their meager retirement funds, which were barely enough to cover the basic necessities of a life they never imagined they would lead at their age. The sight of my father's slumped shoulders and my mother's tear-stained face was a haunting reminder of the high price they paid for their blind favoritism and their refusal to listen to the truth. They had traded their security for the hollow promises of their favorite daughter, and now they were left with nothing but the echoes of their own poor judgment. Despite the heavy guilt that occasionally tugged at my heartstrings, I remained firm in my decision to refuse any further financial responsibility for their new life. I chose to provide them with only a minimal emergency fund, which was a final act of human decency intended to ensure they wouldn't go hungry, but nothing more. I realized that continuing to pay for their mistakes would only perpetuate the toxic cycle of dependency that had nearly destroyed my own life and future. Walter and Lillian had to learn the hard way that their actions and their biases carried real-world consequences that could no longer be erased by my bank account. It was a cold and difficult stance to take, yet it was the only way to ensure that I wouldn't be dragged back into the sinking ship they had helped Colette build. The night I finally left Madison was one of the most quiet and liberating moments I had ever experienced in my entire 28 years of life. I gathered my essential personal belongings, sold every piece of furniture that carried the weight of the past, and drove away in the middle of the night without leaving a forwarding address or a way to be contacted. As the city lights of Madison faded in my rearview mirror, I felt a massive burden lifting from my soul, as if I were finally breathing clean air for the very first time. I didn't look back at the house or the people I was leaving behind, because I knew that my survival depended on my ability to walk away from the wreckage without hesitation. The road ahead was uncertain and lonely, but it was a road that belonged entirely to me, and no one else could ever tell me how to travel it. My new life in Seattle began with a fantastic job opportunity that finally recognized my true worth as a professional and allowed me to live in a beautiful, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the water. In this new sanctuary, I can sit on my own sofa and watch any television program I desire for as long as I want, without a single person interrupting me or questioning my right to be there. There is a profound sense of peace in knowing that every cent I earn is now dedicated to my own well-being and my own future, instead of being drained by ungrateful family members. I have learned that true maturity is not about enduring abuse in silence, but about having the courage to set boundaries that protect your peace of mind at any cost. Cutting off the toxic people in my life was not an act of cruelty, but it was the most effective medicine I could have ever prescribed for my own healing and growth. Before we conclude today's story, please don't rush away, because there are some very important reflections we need to discuss regarding the events Joanna went through. It is easy to judge from the outside, but this story serves as a powerful reminder that kindness without boundaries is not a virtue, but a dangerous invitation for others to exploit your heart. When we allow our love for family to blind us to their destructive behaviors, we aren't just helping them, but we are actually nurturing the very greed and cruelty that will eventually destroy us all. Joanna's decision to walk away wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming her dignity from a system of favoritism that treated her like a tool rather than a human being. This journey also highlights that financial independence and legal literacy are the most powerful weapons anyone can possess when facing manipulation within their own home. We often assume that our relatives will always have our best interests at heart, but as we saw with Colette, even the closest bonds can be severed by the poison of greed and narcissism. If there is one lesson to take away, it is that you are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep people warm who wouldn't even offer you a glass of water in return. I want to know your honest thoughts on how this ended, especially Joanna's choice to leave her parents to face the consequences of their own choices. If you were in her shoes, would you have been able to walk away so completely, or would you have felt obligated to keep supporting your parents despite their betrayal? Is there a different way you would have handled this situation to protect yourself without cutting ties so permanently? Please share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below, because your perspective might help someone else who is currently trapped in a similar situation. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this painful but deeply necessary journey of self-discovery and justice.